Just before the Hungarian Grand Prix, the new Premier League had kicked off in England, with the first goal of the new competition scored by Brian Deane of Sheffield United in a 2-1 win over Manchester United. Elsewhere, Norwich City came from 2-0 down to beat Arsenal 4-2 at Highbury, and Crystal Palace and Blackburn Rovers played out an entertaining 3-3 draw in South London. In the aftermath of the Gulf War in 1991, there had been uprisings among the Kurdish minority in the north of Iraq and the Shia minority in the south of the country, both seeking to use the defeat to topple Saddam Hussein. Since April of that year, there had been the presence of British, Australian and other coalition forces in the north of Iraq to protect the Kurds against reprisals. Now, in August 1992, British Prime Minister John Major announced the creation of 2 no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq, where the Iraqi Air Force was forbidden to operate. The enforcement of these zones, in the first instance by the US Air Force, Royal Air Force and French Armée de l'Air, relied on a slightly creative interpretation of April's UN Resolution 688, which demanded that Iraq allow access by humanitarian groups to the minority areas. The week leading up to the Belgian Grand Prix saw anti-immigration riots in the Baltic German port of Rostock, where a refugee shelter, originally intended to house 300 refugees a month, was now averaging 11,500 a month, mostly Roma people fleeing Romania, who were mostly camping outside the shelter, set up in the Sunflower Building tower block in the Lichtenhagen area of the city. With the city council shrugging its shoulders and refusing to provide sanitation or other facilities for the refugees, tensions were naturally increasing with the local residents, which developed into threats to clean up the area, then to young skinhead gangs throwing stones, while widespread media coverage encouraged neo-Nazi groups from across the former East Germany to converge on Rostock, while the police dithered, unwilling to evoke memories of the old East German police state. By the third day, rioters were roaming the area with baseball bats and Molotov cocktails, cheered on by about 3,000 local residents, while the police were now completely outnumbered and seemed utterly powerless. By the fourth day, the rioters had stopped targeting the refugees at all and were now just fighting the police, but it seemed to fizzle out after that. A few days later, and on the Saturday of Grand Prix weekend, a huge anti-fascist demonstration, some 15,000 strong, marched peacefully through Rostock, under the watchful gaze of a massive police presence. And 2 royal scandals broke within days of each other in the UK. On the 20th of August, the Daily Mirror published pictures of Sarah, the Duchess of York, sunbathing topless with an American financial manager, John Bryan, who was also photographed sucking on her toes. Not to be outdone, The Sun, 3 days later, revealed that it had tapes of Princess Diana talking to a childhood friend, James Gilby, in 1989. She discussed her unhappiness with her marriage to Prince Charles and the royal family in general, while he used the pet name Squidgy or Squidge 53 times in the 30-minute tape. Although The Sun called it Dianagate, the name quickly became Squidgygate. James Gilby was a Lotus car dealer who was also, as it happened, marketing manager for Team Lotus, so when the teams arrived in Belgium for the Grand Prix, he was conspicuous by his absence. The team was also hit by the bankruptcy of one Edward Ball, whose slightly shady firm Landhurst Leasing had been providing finance. Even worse hit, though, were Brabham, for whom the Landhurst money was the only thing keeping them going. In the ensuing fallout, John McDonnell left the team, saying manager Dennis Nursey had turned down a reasonable offer from a South American consortium, and the team filed for bankruptcy themselves. Unable to make the trip to Belgium, it looked very much like the historic team would be wound up unless a miracle occurred. The team may not have been in Spa, but driver Damon Hill was, hoping to find another berth for 1993.
Well, short of grabbing hold of people by the lapels and sort of shaking them about the place and screaming and saying, look, I'm very good and it's really worthwhile taking note of me, you just have to keep your ear to the ground and look for opportunities, which is what I'm doing, which is why I'm here at Spa.
The ongoing Williams driver saga continued too, with Ayrton Senna, negotiations with Ferrari having broken down, now taking out his frustrations on Alain Prost, who he claimed was blocking him moving to Williams because he was afraid to compete against him in equal equipment. With Honda's withdrawal looking ever more likely, Senna said he would retire from F1, which provoked a stir among journalists, but most thought he was just angry and didn't really mean it. Prost, of course, insisted in public that he was doing no such thing and would happily fight Senna in equal cars, while Williams and Renault both shrugged and said, hey, we don't have a contract with either driver, this is nothing to do with us. There was one piece of actual news, though, to cheer the hearts of Ferrari fans, as the team announced that Gerhard Berger would return to Maranello for 1993 on a 2-year contract. Berger had been offered an extension by Ron Dennis, but for all that he and Senna got on well, he was feeling demotivated by his inability to compete with him, while the prospect of reuniting with John Barnard at Ferrari and being able to compete on more equal terms with Jean Alesi was definitely tempting. Ron Dennis, therefore, definitely had one and probably two drivers to replace, and was said to be sniffing around Mika Häkkinen, who, unlike Johnny Herbert, had yet to sign a contract extension with Lotus. The young Finn clearly had talent, but Ron was reportedly thinking of more of a test, development and substitute berth rather than a full race drive, because there were also rumours that McLaren might be talking to Michael Schumacher, clearly an up-and-coming talent like Häkkinen, but with the experience of leading a top team. Riccardo Patrese, all but out the door at Williams, had hoped to replace Ivan Capelli at Ferrari himself, but Niki Lauda reportedly vetoed him, apparently still blaming Riccardo for the 1978 accident that killed Ronnie Peterson, but it was thought that he might find a berth at Benetton, in place of Schumacher if he moved to McLaren, or Martin Brundle, whose qualifying performances had been coming in for some criticism within the team. And JJ Leto announced that he would be leaving Scuderia Italia after 2 years to join Karl Wendlinger at the new Sauber team. Wendlinger had also said that he would be leaving his berth at March after the Portuguese Grand Prix in order to head to Switzerland and begin preparatory work with Peter Sauber, leaving March in need of a driver for Japan and Australia, and a new engineer, as Gustav Brunner sold up his shares and took a contract with Minardi to design their 1993 car. March had one change of driver this weekend too, with Emmanuel Naspetti taking over as planned from Paul Belmondo, while Christian Fittipaldi returned to the Minardi team after 2 months out following his Magny-Cours shunt. Car 17, Emanuele Naspetti. Ancona-born Naspetti first took up karting in 1980 at the age of 12 and stayed in the discipline for 7 years, doing well both domestically and internationally and entering over 200 races. In 1987 he moved into F3 with the Forti Corsi team. In his first year he finished 10th but evidently learned a lot, and the following year he took the title, winning 3 times. That was enough to secure him a berth in Formula 3000 with Ronnie Motorsport, but unfortunately they weren't a competitive team, and a single 5th place was all he could manage. In 1990 Eddie Jordan Racing came knocking, but the team was suffering reliability problems as their focus drifted to preparing for F1, so again he only managed a single point. For 1991 he moved back to Forti Corsi, who had moved up to Formula 3000 and had a much better season, winning 4 races in a row to become a title challenger mid-season. He finished the year 3rd behind Fittipaldi and Zanardi, who hadn't won as often but had been more consistent. For 1992 he continued with the team, winning the Po Grand Prix and coming 2nd at Enna Pergusa, but when the March F1 team came calling, he seized the chance to join Christian and Alessandro among the ranks of F1 drivers. With the absence of Brabham, there was no pre-qualifying, and on Friday morning's free practice, Erik Comas had a terrifying off at Blanchimont, skidding on gravel left a few minutes earlier by JJ Leto and hitting the crash barriers at high speed. One wheel came astray and hit him on the head, knocking him unconscious. Next on the scene was Ayrton Senna, who immediately pulled over and dashed across the track to see if he could help. He discovered that Comas had passed out with his foot still firmly planted on the accelerator, the Renault V10 screaming, so he reached in and tripped the circuit breaker before the engine exploded. Sid Watkins and the medical team arrived shortly afterwards and extracted Eric carefully from his shattered Ligier, but found that fortunately there was nothing physically wrong with him, but with a concussion he was sent home and would take no further part in the weekend, except to thank Senna profusely for potentially saving his life. Saturday's qualifying session was hit by persistent showers. Gerhard Berger came a spectacular cropper but was unhurt, so it was Friday's times that would set the grid, and saw new champion Nigel Mansell on top form, posting a fastest time over 2 seconds ahead of next best Senna, with Schumacher 3rd and a rather lost-looking Patrese 4th over 3 seconds adrift of his teammate. Next year's teammates Alesi and Berger shared row 3, ahead of Thierry Boutsen, who many noted had not stopped to help his teammate, and indeed had nearly mown Senna down as he crossed the track. The Loti were back on form as well, Häkkinen 8th and Herbert 10th, sandwiching Brundle and underlining his indifferent qualification form. Tarquini was an excellent 11th in the Fonmetal, and ahead of Ivan Capelli in the Ferrari to the dismay of the Tifosi, with the other Belgian Erik van der Poel a decent 15th in the other black and red car, and honorary Belgian Bertrand Gachot 20th, just ahead of newboy Naspetti, who was within a credible 7/10 of his team leader Wendlinger, with Morbidelli 23rd, but Christian Fittipaldi still not fully fit, missing out by 3/10. The Andrea Modas were naturally miles off the pace as usual, but while McCarthy was allowed to go out and set a time for a change, he reported that his steering column had seized up. Talking to one of his mechanics, he learned that his chassis was one that had been used for crash tests, while the steering column was one that had been salvaged from a car damaged by Moreno in Hungary, and moreover that the team had specifically told them to fit that to McCarthy's car. Believing that Andrea Sassetti was now actively trying to injure or even kill him to allow them to rehire Enrico Battaglia, Perry left the team. And that wasn't even the biggest of Andrea Sassetti's worries, because the bailiffs arrived on Friday to seize equipment, but were persuaded to go away by being shown invoices. Some mechanics hadn't been paid and were threatening to walk out, which may be why one of them was so forthcoming to Perry, and then on Saturday morning, Belgian police marched down the paddock and arrested Sassetti and sporting director Sergio Zago. Those invoices had been faked, as had at least one of the cheques they'd used to pay a supplier. They were charged with tax fraud and forgery, though the charges were mysteriously dropped and the pair released on Sunday evening. Sunday dawned under grey skies as Mansell set fastest time in the morning warm-up, needing one more win to break the record of 8 wins in a season that he jointly held with Ayrton Senna. The Brazilian had won here in 1985, as well as for the last 4 years in 1988, 89, 90 and 91, so could never be entirely ruled out, even if his equipment seemed second best at the moment. After all, Mansell may have a record to break and the best car, but he was also distracted by the ongoing contract negotiations and just maybe less inclined to try hard with the title already sewn up. Michael Schumacher, meanwhile, was celebrating the anniversary of his F1 debut for the Jordan team here last year, though thanks to the reordering of races, this was actually his 18th Grand Prix. He'd be hoping at the very minimum to do better than on that occasion, when he'd burned his clutch out at the start. As the cars assembled on the grid, Morbidelli's engine failed as he completed his outlap and he had to run into the pits to hop in the spare, while Olivier Guillard watered the plants at the side of the grid. He'd already had an eventful day, having been accosted in the pits by Michele Alboreto, who accused him of having nearly run the footwork off the road in the morning warm-up. With 10 minutes before the parade lap, it began to spit, and umbrellas blossomed on the grid and in the stands, but that gave the teams just 3 minutes to decide whether to go on slicks or wets. Certainly it wasn't officially a wet race, and FISA had made it clear that the race would continue in the rain, with drivers and teams making their own decisions about when to switch tyres, unless the rain was so bad as to make it unsafe to continue. The idea was no more split races and aggregate times. With everyone opting for slicks as it continued to drizzle, the green flag was waved and the race could begin, with 25 cars tearing off the line and Gerhard Berger staying put, as his teammate Senna got the drop on Mansell to go into La Source hairpin in the lead. Berger had broken his transmission and hopped out as Senna led Mansell up to Kemmel, with Patrese third and Schumacher getting past Alesi to reclaim fourth after a lightning start by the Ferrari, while also fighting off a feisty Häkkinen. As the leaders came round the back of the long lap, the marshals were having trouble moving Berger's car, the Austrian having absent-mindedly wandered off without reattaching his steering wheel, and the car was stuck in gear. Mansell was harassing Senna with Patrese right on his tail too, as they came round to complete lap 1, with Schumacher a little way behind, followed by Alesi, Häkkinen, Brundle and Boutsen. It was already starting to rain properly out at the far end of the circuit, sending Martini spinning off in the Dallara, grip-free at the best of times. Schumacher had caught up to the top 3 now as well, and as they headed round lap 2, and Mansell continued ducking and weaving, looking for a way past Senna. Olivier Guillard had a coming together with Karl Wendlinger in La Source and was retirement number 3, and as they blasted through Blanchimont, Mansell pulled over, and despite the slippery surface warning flags, got ahead of Senna to take the lead, with Patrese following through as they entered the bus stop chicane. By now the top 7 were all running together, Mansell, Patrese, Senna, Schumacher, Alesi, Häkkinen and Brundle, as they set off for lap 3. As was often the case at Spa, the track was wet on parts of the course and dry on others, leaving the teams with a dilemma. Stay on slicks and risk going off on the wet bits, or switch to wets, which would rapidly overheat on the dry bits. Brundle overtook Häkkinen at the bus stop, and at the end of the lap, Mansell was the first to make the call and peel in for wet tyres, with Alesi and Alboreto following him in. Mansell rejoined 14th and behind Alesi as Patrese took over the lead and began pulling away from Senna. Schumacher came in next time around along with several others, so it was Brundle's turn to harry Senna until he came in himself along with Häkkinen. all of which promoted Capelli to third, but the real race was back in sixth place, where Alesi, the leading driver on wet tyres, was being held up by Andrea de Cesaris and had Mansell, Schumacher and Brundle all queued up behind. Alesi passed the Tyrrell, while Schumacher nearly managed to get the drop on Mansell as they went by in their turn, while Brundle was repeatedly balked before finally getting through. Patrese came in and had to be held while Capelli came past for his own change, which put Senna back into the lead, with Johnny Herbert now a distant second. Patrese emerged from the pits between Alesi and Mansell, who quickly passed him, and if anyone was still in doubt about the necessity of changing tyres, Aguri Suzuki lost the rear end at the drenched La Source, although he was able to get going again without collecting anyone else. Alesi and Mansell, still going at it 10/10ths, approached a tiptoeing Herbert on his way in for wets. Alesi tried to make a move inside at the bus stop, but from too far back, and was rather cut off by the Lotus bouncing over the curbs, and then as they braked for La Source, the Ferrari fishtailed a bit, and a slight contact was made with Mansell, which was enough to send the Ferrari spinning, and then he stalled his engine trying to rejoin, and Patrese took advantage of all of that to nip back past Mansell into second. Senna, meanwhile, was still in a 10-second lead on slicks, as the rain seemed to have eased off a little, and a dry line was beginning to emerge through Blanchimont. It was actually starting to look like the Brazilian might have got his strategy right and everyone else wrong, as Patrese, Mansell, Schumacher and Brundle all gave chase. Mansell got back past Patrese into the bus stop on lap 9, and a lap later Nigel had the gap to Senna down to 5 seconds, and the rain was again coming down, though still without any real conviction. By the end of lap 11 Mansell was up with Senna, Patrese and the Benetton still in tow, and got past the McLaren with the minimum of fuss as they approached the bus stop. Patrese was next, despite Senna's best efforts, and the Brazilian soon had Schumacher, Brundle and now Häkkinen all queuing up behind as well. Despite his better grip, Schumacher had a hard time getting past Senna, whose 4 extra cylinders told at the important moments, until Schumacher and Brundle went one either side, and then Häkkinen followed through, dropping Senna back to 6th. With Mansell now far enough ahead of him that he could come in for slicks and still get out ahead if it did dry up, Senna decided to come in and switch himself, dropping to 13th. It was about a third distance at this point, with Mansell now leading Patrese by 2.3 seconds, then Schumacher, Brundle and Häkkinen, and Capelli some distance behind the Finn in 6th, as Senna elbowed his way past de Cesaris into 12th, and Naspetti had a moment at La Source while dicing with his teammate Wendlinger. The rain had now eased off to a steady drizzle, enough to keep the track damp and treacherous, but not enough to wet the dry parts. The race had settled down, with Mansell pulling away ahead of Patrese, who was plagued with an exhaust problem, and still had the Benettons close on his heels, with Häkkinen dropping off again. On lap 21, Alboretto's gearbox packed up and he parked at the Raidillon, his first retirement of the year, which put him out of the off-screen scrap between Boots and Leto and Herbert over 7th place, and the lap after that Herbert moved up to 8th past Leto, and indeed the 3 of them were all gaining on 6th place Capelli and the points. Herbert was past Boutsen for 7th on lap 23 as half-distance passed, and immediately began to leave the local hero behind, as Gabriele Tarquini attached himself to the back of Leto's gearbox too. By lap 24 it was still wet at La Source through to Eau Rouge, but it was definitely getting dry around most of the track. Mansell's lap times had increased and he was staying just 9 seconds or so ahead of Patrese, and the team's strategists were again sucking their teeth and thinking about switching back to slicks. In fact, Patrese was catching Mansell despite his exhaust problem, with Schumacher and Brundle still unable to get past the Williams, while Herbert had now caught Capelli. Lotus were just 6 points behind Ferrari in the constructors' table, and with Alesi out and Häkkinen holding 5th, Herbert saw an opportunity to cut that deficit to 3 points. After staving off the Lotus for a lap or so, Capelli's V12 saw an opportunity to explode, and took it, dumping the unhappy Ivan in the gravel at Stavolo, joining his countryman Tarquini, who'd had his good race ruined by an engine failure the previous lap. At the end of that lap, Boutsen came in to be the first driver to switch to slicks, as a definite dry line had appeared around most of the lap. Patrese and co lapped the Jordans, still both going, albeit a long way back, and they were by now moving over to cool their tyres on wet patches. Senna, meanwhile, had made his way back up to 7th and was chasing Johnny Herbert. The Williams team were getting the tyres out, but it was Senna in first on lap 28, a very slick stop of a hair over 5 seconds, but Boutsen had already come unstuck on his slicks and stuck it into the barriers at Blanchimont, so it might still have been a bit early. On the other hand, those on wets were also finding grip a bit hard to come by, as Schumacher demonstrated at Stavolo, getting onto the grass and allowing Brundle up into third. Spotting as he passed that Brundle's tyres were blistered, Michael came in for slicks at the end of the lap, followed by Johnny Herbert. On lap 30, Senna put up a 2 minutes and 6 second lap, his first flying lap on dry tyres, knocking 3 seconds off the previous pace, only to spin on the slippery La Source while passing Leto and see Herbert emerge from the pits ahead of him. Spin aside, the lap times spoke for themselves, and soon the rest were streaming in for tyres. Brundle was first, but something stuck and he was back out behind Schumacher, who was taking lumps out of Patrese lead, while Williams still seemed to be dithering about switching to slicks. Patrese finally came in on lap 32, emerging behind Schumacher, who'd put up a sub-2 minute lap, as Häkkinen also changed. Mansell was in next time around after having been held up by a scrapping Suzuki and De Cesaris. Nigel peeled in as Senna passed Herbert and set about Leto again. Mansell's stock was good, 6.3 seconds, but Schumacher was already past, taking the lead of a Grand Prix for the first time in his 17.5 race career and putting up a 1 minute 58 lap in celebration. Mansell was 4.2 seconds behind and charging, with Patrese 18 seconds behind his teammate in third, with Brundle on his tail and Häkkinen a lowly fifth, Senna sixth and closing, Leto seventh, and Herbert now back down to eighth. Schumacher was held up, getting past the man he'd replaced at Jordan last year, Bertrand Gachot, who spun at La Source as soon as the Benetton was passed, with Patrese and Brundle having less problems getting past the LaRousse as they continued their scrap. Mansell set a series of fastest laps as he chased Schumacher as the race went into its final laps, but Schumacher responded by breaking the lap record, which was immediately broken again by Senna. Schumacher was held up for half a lap by Modena Jordan, which allowed Mansell to close within 3 seconds, as Gachot had another spin at La Source. Mansell was now within reach of Schumacher, but his engine was starting to sound very rough indeed. The Renault had thrown a bank of exhausts, and with it 14 to 1500 RPM, and Mansell suddenly found himself unable to even pull away from Stefano Modena and was forced to watch Schumacher disappear off into the distance. With 5 laps to go, all Mansell could hope to do now was finish, while Schumacher seemed home free to take his maiden win. The main question now, as Schumacher made the lead 25 seconds, was who would join him on the podium. Would Mansell's engine go the distance, and would Patrese be able to hold off Brundle? If the answer to both of those questions was no, the Benetton team's second ever 1-2 finish was on the cards. The scrapping Patrese and Brundle were gaining on Mansell too, though Ricciardo still had to make up a 10-second deficit while also fending off the Benetton behind him, not to mention getting held up by the ongoing scrap between Suzuki and De Cesaris, neither of them particularly willing to go off the dry line to let the battling leaders through. Herbert moved up ahead of Leto into 7th, while Häkkinen had been caught by Senna, who came past under braking into Les Combes as Schumacher began his last lap. As the yellow and green Benetton made its way around the track, the yellow and green Lotus of Johnny Herbert was pulling over, its own Ford V8 having failed just to go the distance. But nothing was going to stop Michael Schumacher coming round to take his first win, almost exactly a year since his debut. He was the first German since his sports car teammate Jochen Mass in 1975 to win a Grand Prix, but that had been a shortened race, and the last German to win a full-length Grand Prix was Wolfgang von Trips, who was brought up in Schumacher's hometown of Kerpen in 1961. At 23 years old, 7 months and 27 days, Schumacher was also the youngest winner in some time, just a few months short of Bruce McLaren's all-time record of 22 years, 3 months and 12 days, set in 1959. Mansell did manage to hang on to second, with Patrese holding off Brundle for third, thanks to the intervention of Suzuki and De Cesaris, so Williams Renault, in the French concern's 200th Grand Prix, had to settle for making the Constructors' Championship official, though it would have taken an extraordinary turnaround for them to have lost it at this stage. Nonetheless, it was a cause for celebration for Bernard Dudot and the Renault marque after some 15 years of effort and 200 races as both a constructor and engine supplier. Brundle, Senna and Häkkinen took the remaining points, with Leto an encouraging 7th for the underperforming Scuderia Italia after a very rough season, with De Cesaris and Suzuki finishing 8th and 9th, Van der Poel a very creditable 10th in his home race. Naspetti also acquitted himself well, especially considering he hated driving in the rain, finishing 12th behind Wendlinger, and despite Gachot having one final spin on lap 41, he'd gone far enough to be classified 18th and last. Despite the early flurry of retirements, it had actually been a fairly attrition-free race. Schumacher's 10 points lifted him not only above Senna to third in the standings, but put him just 1 point behind Riccardo Patrese as the race to be best of the rest hotted up, while Benetton went up to second in the constructors' standings, and Lotus's sole points took them to within 5 points of Ferrari. Not as good as it could have been, but given the relative momentum of the two teams, it was looking like the recovering Norfolk team could yet finish above the illustrious Scuderia. Celebrations for Benetton, for Schumacher and for Germany, and Bernie Ecclestone would no doubt be hoping that the advent of a new young star would give the TV ratings a shot in the arm outside Germany too. All agreed that it seemed unlikely this would be Schumacher's last win. Michael looked like he could barely believe it on the podium as Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit played for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Mansell, clearly in a bad mood, took aim during the press conference at Lazy and at the Williams team, both for their decision to keep him out later than he wanted to change tyres and for the ongoing contract situation. The Italian Grand Prix, next on the calendar, seemed to often be the venue for big announcements, and many thought things would have to come to a head soon.